Hey folks, welcome back to Tenta Outdoors. My name is Alan from season 10 of Alone, and I'm going to do a recap of season 11, episode 2, starting right now. So folks, I'm in Vancouver visiting family, so I'm filming this across the street from my mom's house in East Vancouver in Trout Lake Park. So there's people everywhere, there's cars going by, there's nowhere close by I can escape to true wilderness, so forgive me for any interruptions. So this episode starts with Timber, the humanitarian aid worker, and as he gets dropped off, he says, "This is exactly what I've been waiting for." So the next scene, they show Timber moving through the bush, and he's finding a ton of bear and moose tracks, which gives an indication of how frequently those large game species are moving through his area. So right after he kills a squirrel, he rolls up his sleeve and he reveals the tattoo he has on his shoulder of like a carnivorous mouth with sharp teeth and a little bear paw in the middle. And he takes a little bit of blood from the squirrel and he goes, "I gotta feed the teeth." And he rubs a little bit of blood on the teeth of his tattoo. Pretty wild. So he takes some of the guts from his squirrel and sets a series of set lines along the bank of his river, and he immediately gets to work building his temporary shelter. Not long after that, well, according to the edit, not long after that, he heads down to the riverbank to check his set lines. Sure enough, he's got a decent sized pike on the end of one of his set lines. I'm watching that and I'm going, oh my God, that's so awesome, because during my time out there, and I know other contestants from my season did that too, man, I had squirrel guts, I had grouse guts, I had a sack of fish eggs that I made out of some gauze in the first aid kit, and I had set lines out for days and days on end, and not once did I even get a sniff of activity on any of my set lines. Yeah, the fish in Reindeer Lake seemed to be only interested in moving targets, like lures you had to create and that were moving through the water as you retrieved them. That's how I caught all my fish out there except for one fish in my gill net. Nice work on the set line, Timber. So Timber knows he doesn't really have time to preserve any of the food he's caught on day one, and he did really well. He's got a big pike and a squirrel on the very first day. So instead of worrying about preserving it, he's got way too much stuff to do. So he says, I'm gonna eat like a hunter tonight. And he boils up the pike, and as that pike is cooking, he also consumes a squirrel. So he made a comment, now this is a good supper. The next scene, they show Timber kind of talking about the potential of winning that much money from being the last person standing on the show. And he says he'd do pretty much anything to have the opportunity at that cash prize. So they show the quiver that Timber bought, and it's a fairly large leather quiver, and he mentions he's got another use in mind for it. He completely sealed it with beeswax and is using it for a large water vessel to store his purified water, which is a very smart idea. He also uses his leather arm guard to make a bow-mounted quiver to replace the quiver that turned into his large water canteen. Well done, Timber. Are you ready for the best line of the show? Timber's on the beach, the sun's coming down on him, he films his shadow on the sand, he looks at the shadow and goes, "Now that is the image of a warrior hunter." So the next series of scenes were super intense. And you gotta admit, there's something about the way Timber story tells and narrates his experience out there that really draws the reader in and makes it really hard not to listen to and get totally involved in this story. So as he's walking along the beach, he comes across a fresh set of moose tracks. It looks like it had walked across the river and climbed up the bank. And of course, he follows them. Soon after that, he notices a massive bull moose on the other side of his swamp. He's getting excited, checks the wind, he knows it's in his left ear, and he makes a plan to put on a stalk on that moose. So he moves closer, he puts some cover between him and the moose, and he starts doing some calls. To make a long story short, the moose responded, and it started coming towards him closer and closer and closer. And he keeps looking to the camera, 300 yards, 150 yards, and you're watching this moose close the distance until it's in bow range. Gosh, man, my heart was going, because the way the producers put this scene in the previews for the show, it looked like he hit the moose and made a successful shot. So he draws back, they play some intense music, and he lets the arrow fly. Unfortunately, it goes just low under the moose's brisket. And the moose takes off, stops in the bushes, and he has a second opportunity at the moose. He draws back, shoots, and he said about 10 yards before the moose, the arrow deflects off a twig and he misses the moose. Oh my gosh, super intense scene. I loved it. I was right there with him. It was awesome. After that scene, They show Timber kind of sitting on a log, kind of reminiscing about how intense that experience had been, and he mentioned that that opportunity was his golden ticket, and it didn't work out. Super upsetting, and I understand how he's feeling. Yeah, that was a tough scene. It'll be interesting to see how Timber recovers from that situation, if he can like change his mindset into positive and keep pushing forward. Because realistically, if that moose is in the area, there is a chance he could call it in for a second time and get another opportunity at it. Sarah is next on the episode. Sarah is the operator of the Alaskan fishing resort that she runs with her husband. Her first scene is setting up her cameras, getting used to the whole filming yourself thing, and I think she realizes, and it's good for the viewers to notice this too, I think she realizes how difficult it is to actually be filming yourself while you're trying to survive. She whips up a quick tarp shelter, utilizing a large tree branch to make it even quicker, which is a good idea to get your shelter up right away so you have a place to put your gear and stay dry, and you can get to work doing other things like exploring and procuring food. So the next scene, they show Sarah heading out exploring, but she doesn't bring her bow. She finds a bolete mushroom, picks a few berries, and she comes across this pond like a small lake. Sure enough, she's surprised by a beaver smacking its tail on the water. She instantly regrets not taking her bow. Then she says to the beaver, she goes, "I'm gonna find where you're working, I'm gonna shoot you, and then I'm gonna eat you." Sarah starts doing some additional work on her wiki-up style shelter, and they show her trying to find something to brush her hair with out there. I really liked her shelter location actually, because she's got this huge row of trees. I think they're poplars, totally protecting her from the wind. And man, being on Reindeer Lake, having wind protection can be a real game changer. So that evening, Sarah grabs her bow, heads back down to the beaver pond to try to get another opportunity at that big chunk of protein and fat. So she waits there for a while. She's starting to get a little bit disheartened, maybe blaming herself for not bringing her bow the first time, but sure enough, the beaver appears and actually starts swimming directly towards her. I don't know how close it was, but it looked like it was maybe 10 yards, 15 yards. That's what it looked like. She had a good opportunity at it. She drew her bow back, shot, and according to the footage, I actually thought she nailed it. She must have just missed it. And they show her swimming into the water to, well, not swimming. They show her walking into the water to retrieve her arrow, and she was hoping that the beaver was on the other end of the arrow, but unfortunately she had missed it. I hope she doesn't get too down on herself, because knowing that beaver's there, knowing where it is, knowing where it's working, I wouldn't doubt if she gets another opportunity at that beaver. Did anybody else get a little bit nervous when Sarah was stumbling up that slippery, muddy bank with that broadhead-tipped arrow in her hand? I did. Next on the episode was Dusty, the welder from Arkansas. And they show him kind of walking through the bush exploring, noticing the constant cloud cover, and he realizes how easy it would be to get lost without the use of the sun as a navigation tool. So Dusty finds a good shelter spot out of the wind, and he gets right to work building a lean-to style shelter using pretty good sized logs. He mentioned he wants to make sure he gets most of his hard work completed early in the game while he has the calories and energy to get it done. And he also mentioned he does not want to spend a lot of time or energy on his permanent shelter, and he wants to worry about procuring food, which is a smart idea. I gotta say, Dusty, you have a great laugh. It's like so infectious. So in the next scene, they show Dusty feeding on some rose hips, and he discusses how this environment is completely new to him. And it kind of reminded me of Mikey. Mikey being from so far down south and being in the environment in season 10, he said the exact same thing. And it took Mikey definitely some time to adjust, but he figured it out. And I'm sure Dusty will too. So Dusty sets up a squirrel pole, which is simply just a pole leaning against a tree with the idea that the squirrels are gonna kind of use that pole as a shortcut to get up into the larger trees. And the pole has a series of snares along it. So if they get by one, without getting caught, hopefully they'll get caught in the next one, and so on. And when it's off the ground like that, when they do get caught in the snare, they struggle, they fall off, and well, you know what happens. Shortly after that scene, they actually show him making a successful shot on a squirrel. Now I love the way Dusty described how he was drawing on that squirrel. He felt like he was drawing on the biggest buck of his life. And he was so nervous, his heart was going. He's like, this is just a squirrel, but man, I felt like I was shooting a monster whitetail buck, Because you got to remember, when you're out there, every piece of protein that you get, one grouse, one squirrel, one rabbit, one fish, could provide you with enough nutrients to go on for one more day or 2 more days, which could be the difference between winning or losing the entire competition. Up next is Peter, the librarian from British Columbia, Canada. And they start him on day 2. They didn't show any footage from day 1, but he did make reference that his day 1 was very confusing. He was quite disoriented, but there was no footage or anything from that, so it kind of left the audience guessing what went down on day 1. His next scene was going over his goals for the day. Goal 1, enjoy the sunrise. Goal 2, boil some water. And goal 3, get started on a shelter. So Peter gathers some tinder and other materials for building his fire, and they show him struggling with his ferro rod to ignite the tinder that he gathered. Obviously the tinder was wet, and so after a time he gave up, put the tinder in his pocket, and he was going to try again later. He sets out exploring his area and finds a massive grizzly track. Then he makes reference to day 1. He said, man, I had so many feelings of being overwhelmed and I was disoriented. And he actually mentioned he woke up that morning with some of those same feelings. Folks, drop shock is definitely a real thing. I mean, just imagine you've spent months preparing. You've had all this excitement and nervousness, and you're anxious. And then all of a sudden, on whatever date they got dropped off, you see the helicopter or the boat taking off. You've got your camera gear, you've got your backpack, and it's on. And those feelings can be overwhelming of like, you've got so much to do, and sometimes when your brain is like flooded with all the things you have to do, it can definitely be overwhelming. So after having the tinder in his pocket for a while, he heads back to his fire pit, and he is successful almost immediately getting his fire going. The next scene, Peter shows off his belly, and he gets right to work on his permanent shelter. And I like his thinking of a small shelter, just big enough to sleep and have a small workspace. So Peter's shelter is a willow frame dome shelter, and he's going to call it the Turtle Lair. And it was after this moment, he had been working on his shelter for a while, you could really see Peter's mental state shift to a more positive place. It was cool to see. Next up in the episode, we have Jake the falconer. And it was cool because the next series of shots was Jake identifying all the different falcons that he's noticing in his area. So one of the first things we learned about Jake is that his 300 yards of monofilament fishing line, the spool that he was storing it on, fell out of the side pocket of his backpack because he had left the zipper open. And he's been looking for the last 3 days or so trying to find it, and he can't find it. But he talks about how he's not going to wallow in his own shame, because if he's wallowing in his shame, it prevents him from moving forward and adjusting and adapting to the situation. So what does he do? He starts building his gill net out of the inner strands of paracord, completes it, and gets it in the water. So Jake is one of the few competitors in this show's history that did not bring a ferro rod to start his fires. He's going to employ all the other techniques for fire starting that he knows. Shortly after that, he uses the bow and drill technique and gets a fire going. Said it took him about half an hour. So Jake's next scene was pretty informative and pretty cool. To save calories and time for starting fires, Jake created pure charcoal out of his cooking pot and stored them in a birch firebox that he made like a perfectly sealed top and bottom for. So once he had that birch bark fire container filled with charcoal, he showed us one of his other ideas. His belt buckle was made out of carbon steel, and he found a piece of quartzite rock on the beach, and he struck the rock on his belt buckle, creating a small spark that landed inside his firebox on the charcoal, and he almost immediately created a tiny little ember that he blew on and nursed into a fire. So Jake heads down to the river to check his gill net. Unfortunately, it's empty, but he is surprised by a beaver slapping his tail on the water, just like what happened to Sarah. So he actually has a shot opportunity at this beaver, but he decides not to take it because he wants to draw the beaver onto the shore against the bank, so he could recover the animal much more easily than shooting it in the water. And you also don't risk losing your arrow in the water as well. So he makes a bait. He grabs a fresh piece of willow and he sticks it in the shore, hoping the beaver would come back to retrieve this willow because he understands that beavers like to eat fresh willow bark. And unfortunately, the beaver stays, I think he mentioned it was 500 yards away and doesn't come back in. And he regrets not taking the shot opportunity when he had it. But kind of like what I said for Sarah, if there's a beaver there and you know about where it is, I'm pretty sure he'll have another opportunity at it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for sticking around to the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm looking forward to next Thursday night. Check back on my channel on Friday for the episode 3 recap. We'll see you next time.